we're going to run this today is let Grant go through a number of slides and just give you general information on a lot of things that we're dealing with right now when it comes to the regulatory world, and specifically a big focus on methane regulations and various topics related to that. We're going to have Grant do the presentation this morning, 45 minutes or so, maybe a little longer, depending on that. And we'll open up some time starting around 11:15, 11:20 to offer Q&As. As opposed to having questions when we move through this, this is going to be more of a general overview session. And if you get questions, just hang on to them and we'll get to them at the end of the program. With that, I am very pleased and grateful to introduce Grant Swartzwelder from OTA Environmental. He can talk a little bit more about his company and what they do. I had the opportunity to meet Grant in his attendance of our annual meeting last year, and then I ran into him this past fall at the IPAA conference, and that's sort of how all of this came together. Grant does a number of things online in terms of information, regulatory, newsletters, videos. It's just an amazing suite of information. If you haven't had a chance, please check it out. I'll let Grant tell you more about that. But in the meantime, welcome, Grant, and take it from here.
Jim, really appreciate the introduction and the opportunity. It's like Jim mentioned, we had met through an introduction of a mutual friend of ours, and not to make this a pat each other on the back session, but they were very complimentary of what IPANM and Jim and Casey were doing, and so I was very glad to meet him and find ways that we could work together on different things. And attending the annual meeting, and we're now members of the Independent Petroleum Association of New Mexico, and look forward to working with Jim. The other thing that excited me about this was that it was up in Farmington, but unfortunately I wasn't able to come up. But one of the first transactions I ever did, and several things was up in Farmington. So I would go up to Farmington on a regular basis. Now I tended to avoid the December, January, February timeframe because well, I'm a Texas boy and like it warm, but the rest of the time was fantastic, and loved my time coming up to Farmington and have some great memories with people like John Byram and T. Greg Marion and a variety of others that had a chance to work with. So the purpose of this, Jim mentioned, I am president of OTA Environmental Solutions. We provide equipment for emissions, vapor recovery units, layers, combustors, instrument air. We provide field service on our equipment and other people's equipment, preventative maintenance field service. And we have an environmental group that does things from LDAR to greenhouse gas to tier 2 and phase 1s. So we try to, it's a little triangle that tries to interact with each service and each product to give an overall good solution. And so one of the biggest things that we're believers in is educating the public and the oil companies, because there's a lot of, when you're dealing with the EPA and various regulatory entities, those are not the easiest things to understand and to implement into everyday operations. And so in a little bit, I'll tell you how to get some of the additional white papers that we put together, videos that we show, several with New Mexico. As you know, New Mexico is trying its best to be a leader, and you put that in quotes, on regulatory type and enforcement. And so it really creates a lot of challenges for the New Mexican operator.
Grant, I'm going to interrupt for just a moment. Folks out there, please put your microphones on mute unless you're asking a question or talking. We are getting some feedback, and that'll make it easier for everybody to hear. Thanks.
Jim, I think you can also, by clicking on there, you can mute them yourself as the, that's another option as well.
Okay.
All right. Very good. So let's start off. You know, what's frustrating about all the additional regulation and changes is that it's in light of some really positive things for the industry. And hopefully y'all can see these graphs to show, and it really shows one main thing, that the industry as a whole is doing up to this point has done a very, very good job of improving its emissions and environmental profile. If you look on the graph on the left, you see that the methane emissions threshold is 0.2%, and you see how we've gone from 0.4% in 2015 down to 0.21%, a fantastic increase. And you see above that on the methane emissions, the green bars, how we've also gone down significantly from 2015 and really in the last couple of years as people have been focused. This needs to be updated with 2022 EPA data that was just released about a month and a half ago. So, but it continues to show a real good response by the industry. What you also then are able to do, and this is all from EPA information, you're able to look and see from a component standpoint the what is happening. And again, with that arrow going down, you see a significant decrease in the emissions that the industry has provided. There's really two numbers that jump out in this whole conversation. One is 25,000 metric tons of CO2. And that's really where subpart W kicks in, and where above which you really start having to worry about a lot more regulatory and methane tax. And then as far as methane tax, as I just mentioned, that 0.2% is a very important thing, because above which, that's when methane tax starts kicking in. We'll talk about that more in just a second. So the frustrating thing is that as we're doing well, given the rules, now they're changing the rules. And what you've seen with the nice thing is they haven't even told everyone what the rules are. But all of this is going to increase the reporting numbers that the industry has, and it's going to be significant. You're talking, this is from the EIR, so it's a fairly recognized data. They're talking about going up from that 2021 number up by 130% with the changes that they are proposing. So it's almost like it's moving the goal line. And what you see on the graph on the right is how 2021 is around that 1.9 million. But because of each of these changes, from defining flare efficiency differently, worrying about combustor slip, leaks through factors is a huge part, and then super emitters, then all of a sudden you end up seeing it jump up to closer to 4 million, which is going to have several effects on the industry and on companies separately. When you look over on the left, you have the various factors or categories that are increasing. Super emitter is an interesting one, and we'll talk about all of these a little bit more later. But this basically allows for every the proverbial Karen that's out there with a camera, a FLIR camera, to be able to go and identify what they believe are super emitters. There's really no rules as to what that is and who's qualified, but basically they're deputizing the world, and primarily environmental advocacy groups, to go out and identify what they believe is a super emitter. That's going to increase the paperwork, increase the potential issues drastically. The higher emissions factors, there's about 50 categories. As you'll see in all the subpart W, it's a very analytical, empirical type process. And so it's all number based, and they talk about how many components you have. Well, each component has a different factor. Well, now they're increasing those factors, the amount of those factors, which then is going to increase what the resulting emissions profile will look like. Another one that's really going to be a huge issue is combustion slip. This is really going to be an effect for gathering systems, pipelines, those that have significant amount of compression. I've talked to several folks, and no one has an answer for how to deal with the slip. This is gas that's coming from the engine, and what do you do with that emissions? And so they're creating this issue, but there's really no solution out there right now. Now that pushes to do it, but it's going to penalize us in the meantime. And then the destruction efficiencies on flares. they've traditionally said that a flare has a 98% emissions factor. They're talking about lowering that down to 92%, which by definition means that that creates more emissions and more challenges from a regulatory standpoint. The whole start of this is with that subpart W, because again, if you're over that 25,000 tons, then you start kicking into a variety of factors. Right now, they've done the final rule, as you know, as of December 2nd, but there's still a lot of questions as to how that's going to really be implemented. There's, it's going to push it down to the states. The states come up with rules. It's come back up. So the one benefit of this whole thing is a lot of these things are not going to be really thrown at us for at least a year to 3 years. So it's kind of a question of how fast do you move? If you want to be a good steward, but you don't really know what the rules are. And so if you're not careful, you're going to potentially kind of go in the wrong direction because you won't know what the rules are. This federal mandate under the Clean Air Act is a very sneaky thing there that's been done. It's up until this point, there's not been a lot of enforcement or audit compliance type capabilities, but doing it under the Clean Air Act, it creates the opportunity for enforcement, meaning fines, audits, penalties. And so they're really starting to put teeth into this. Again, it's not clear how all that's going to work. So I wouldn't jump out today and worry about it, but it is something that they're positioning for later on. The facility redefinition is another one of those kind of ambiguities in the regulation that really could bite the industry, because now they're talking about identifying that to a well pad level and how they define a facility. What that could do is really increase the numbers of facilities, wells, locations that are going to be subject to the regulation. A variety of unknown things like transfer of ownership. This especially speaks to the methane tax. But if you sell a property mid part of the year, how is that handled? Is that who's responsible for all the methane tax, the various regulatory? Is it split in half? How that's handled is very unknown. And then, we're going to talk about numbers quite a bit in this conversation, and component inventory count, again, because it's an empirical based calculation. Understanding your components and what you have on your location is going to be so very, very important. So let's talk about the methane tax. Casey and Jim, I'd also mentioned that it looks like we have some people still in the waiting room. Here, I can actually let them in real quick. Sorry about that. I just took care of Jim, so we're good. So the methane tax, the real basics of this is that, again, it's at 25,000 metric tons and above that you become subject to. And then looking at everything above the 0.2% that we talked about, thus why those two numbers are so important. It starts January 1st, so we're in that period now. However, the challenge becomes that they really haven't identified how that's going to be processed, how it's going to really be calculated. Again, you don't really have the factors completely figured out, so it becomes very challenging. But with those revisions, you could see that we're talking around when we did some calculations for 2021, that looked like the taxable liability was around $600 million. But if you increase the subpart W with those factors and some of the other things, that could go up significantly. And as I put here, there are some of the reports I've seen has it up to 3 times. So it really could have a huge effect on the industry. The other part is public perception. I think we all agree that the industry as a whole has not done the best job of telling everyone the great things that we've done for the country, for emissions, for the environment. And what's going to potentially happen here is we go from being 0.2, and it jumps up. And you can right now see the various folks out there talking about how the industry is getting worse. Well, it's not getting worse. It just changed the rules and how this is done. And then the other part that we're going to talk about is it really affects the small producers. The methane tax is at 14%. It's really you got your components and various factors, numerical type calculations up to some numerator, and then production is the economy. And so the larger companies, the Conocos, the Shells, they have huge production, which allows them to overcome whatever is in the numerator side. But what happens with the small producer and marginal producers is that you have a bunch of wells, a bunch of facilities, and so you have a large component content, and so that numerator is a decent size. And then by definition, as a marginal producer, you end up having less production. And so you can see with a smaller denominator, slightly larger numerator, that's how you push it up to the above the 14%. You know, it's you look at the 0.21%, you say, well, the industry overall is not going to be affected. Well, however, if you take out the Conocos and the Shells and all that large production and start looking at individual companies, it looks like around 65% of the operators out there will be affected, mainly because there's a lot of small producers out there. So again, data is going to be so key because of how the formulas are written, also how regulators are really starting to enforce this. And you see that especially in New Mexico, where you've seen some large fines with Newborn, Matador, Meredith, and a lot of that is because of emissions. But how do they know that? It's all because of what is being reported by the producer. And what happens, and you look in some of the fines that were made, it's also that these producers have not reported everything in a very accurate way or complete way. And so they fine you for that as well. So it puts the operator in a very tough position. You've got to report it, otherwise you get fined or audited. But if you report it, you have a chance of really stepping into the crosshairs of some of the emissions requirements. That is where really understanding the data that you're putting in and making sure it's accurate and defendable, but then also looking at how you can lower those numbers. That is really the key in components. And you'll see that, for example, we had a company we dealt with that they had 5,000 components year after year after year. Well, it turned out they had never done an audit. They did an audit and reduced it to 3,000, which, as you can see, would have a huge effect on their subpart W. But that's only part of it, because once you look at those components, you have to also be able to say, do we really need them? Are they even working? And if so, you need to mark them as kind of a best practice. First, you get a good inventory. Then you need to make sure that you actually are using them. If not, either put an X on them or take them out, so that if you get audited, you don't have those components to worry about to increase that numerator. You know, the other part is we see this also is that within the EPA state agencies, there's an inconsistency among operators that we see. There's a large operator that you would recognize that when we were looking at some numbers, they had 1 million barrels of oil additional in the Railroad Commission filings they did versus the EPA filing. And in the past, that wouldn't really matter. But now what happens is because of the methane tax and scrutiny of that public data, you end up getting yourself in trouble by not being accurate with how you file that. So again, the bad news here is that it's really low, marginal, lower producers that are kind of the one that's kind of getting the main detriment of this, all of these regulatory. And what they're pointing at is that 6% of the total production equals about 50% of emissions. Now, a lot of that, again, because of the numerical way they look at it, is because of the components and how they're calculating that. So I question whether that's really accurate, but how they calculated, how they decided, it really is. And so it's really the slow producers, the small producers that are going to have uh, the biggest challenge. The subpart W revisions are going to affect them more. And then you throw in the administrative and data issues that this all takes time and effort to do. And small producers, by definition, don't have the environmental staffs, the administrative staff. And so it really becomes a challenge. Then you throw in the heat pump. If you're trying to change, say you're changing your pneumatic valves, actuators, and use instrument air. Well, that could cost you from 10 to 30, $40,000, depending on the size of the facility. Well, depending on your production level, that might not be an economic benefit. So it really puts you in a sensitive position from a capital standpoint, from an LOE standpoint. So looking at what your priorities are on how to reduce those numbers and do it in a cost-effective method really becomes a challenge. With all of this, we've been doing this for, I guess, close to 15 years. And one thing that we continue to see is that sometimes people jump out there and start doing things before all the regulation has come together. The flip side of that is they've already got methane tax and got some of these things kicked in to place, but they don't have the adequate rules and detail associated with it. But that unclear world that we're in really makes it hard to determine what the strategy is, how to respond to those rules and regulations. The other thing that we really see is that it's really hard, unless you're a lawyer and really want to spend a lot of time understanding what those rules and regulations really are. If you go onto our website, we actually have for New Mexico a variety of white papers on waste rule, other rules that try to lay out some of those. I think we might have taken one or two off. So if you're interested in those, email me. I'll give my email at the end, and I'm happy to give you an overview that we put together on some of the New Mexico rules. We also have on there some things about Quad OA, B, C that can also kind of hopefully lay it out in a layman's form. That's why what Jim is doing here is, I think, so important, because it's really all about education and understanding what the rules are, the regulations are, and then you can figure out how to respond to that. Let's see. Oh, the other kind of thing, walking more the run, and we'll talk about best practices, is really focusing on those low hanging fruit. The device count is the easiest. It's just getting a count, understanding it. So when you're filing your greenhouse gas, you're more accurate. And usually it's going to be lower than what you had, because folks have not counted over the while. And it's amazing how the creep on the numbers have really increased. The other thing that we're seeing with New Mexico, we're also seeing it in Texas with the TCEQ, is a more scrutiny on the permits and SPCCs. And on the permits, I'm talking air permits. And so making sure that you have air permits on what you need to have, that they're updated, because if you make certain changes, then you're going to need to update those. But the more you can have the basics taken care of, that makes it harder for the regulator to come after you, because you've already got the basics done. And so when they ask, you can show it to them, and they tend to say, well, they've got their act together, let's move on to something else. The last thing is, don't go crazy. And I see that within sustainability reports, some equipment purchases, but the sustainability reports, you're seeing some folks, typically public companies, typically larger, but now, I'm seeing some smaller companies really go out and put a 40, 50-page sustainability report together. Well, data is great, but you don't want to advertise it to the world. And because if you do, then you're creating a roadmap for people to audit you, to look at, and you're basically creating additional liability with the more data, the more information that you put out. So I think you need to think very carefully about how much you put out there. If you've got investors who need to do a sustainability report or something like that, great, but limit it to a few pages, and then you can always say you're adding to it, and then that trend is what they're looking for. Look, I've already done this, I've added a few more pages. There's positives that you can talk to your investors or your banks about, but don't lay everything out in a large document, because there is a decent chance that you're going to create more liability by just not doing things accurately. So one of the big parts of the final rule is having to do with, LDAR, ABO, method 22, all the variety of ways of seeing if you've got emissions. It's, if you're in Quad A, subject to Quad A, then you need to do LDAR, and it's usually every 6 months. You have 6 months thereafter. What the state is doing, what federal is doing, is starting to require through like Quad B and Quad C, it's expanding which wells have to have that type of review, but then it's also making it so that they're really trying to force you to do it quarterly or even monthly. And they're making it more difficult because you got federal requirements and state requirements. So to know which is which and what you're required by which, again, makes it very hard for the average operator to understand that. The other part with this and what's going to force people to do more LDAR is that what they're on the final rule proposing is that when you have a leak, you find a leak, then what they'll do is say that that leak has been going on since the day after you last did your last LDAR. So that could be 6 months, and that would increase the amount of volume of that leak. If you do it quarterly, then it would only go back 3 months. And so it makes the numbers different. However, as you can figure out, that means more time, cost, more operational work to do it quarterly or more frequently than if you do it for 6 months. So it depends what the cost benefit there. As we talked about LDAR, this is slides from our report. Again, I think this white paper is on our website, OTA so you can pull it out. But we work with many customers. We do about 1,700 LDARs every 6 months. This is a customer in the Permian that we've worked with for 5-6 years. And this shows the green is the number of leaks, and the blue is the number of leaks per survey. We had to do it leaks per survey because if you see in the orange, the number of surveys have increased over 100. So it really kind of makes it a little better to be able to compare. So what that shows is this company has really benefited by doing a consistent LDAR program. So there is economic benefit, there's regulatory benefit, because you can eliminate leaks. At the end of the day, everyone talks about all this data, but if you really what you're needing to do is just eliminate the leaks. You eliminate the leaks or minimize those, then all the data, all the reporting needs to go itself. I know that's a little general and a little maybe too verbose, but it has a lot of elements of truth, and that you just take care of those. And then public relations benefit also. If you just don't have leaks, then it's harder for folks to come after you. The other byproduct of doing the survey or this study was that we then keep up with where the leaks were coming from. And what's interesting, you look at so many different data sets out there, and they all tell you slightly different as to what is the most likely source of your leaks. In this case, this is a program or the study we did with this customer. It says that 40% have to do with deep patches, 17% fittings, and then another 17% or 23%, I'm sorry, and then 17% with vent valves. A lot of that can be fixed with a crescent wrench or just some, tightening some things up. The thief hatches on the other hand has to do with, what do you do from a operational standpoint? We'll talk about that. But the key point of this is identifying what your leaks are and then fixing them. And you see from the historical trend that this company has done a good job of that and has significantly reduced their leaks that they've experienced in each of those components. I mentioned, there's different ways of calculating this, and this is from EPA data, and it shows that combustion equipment, flares primarily, have been one of the larger providers of emissions, and then pneumatics. And and probably the key is that fourth bullet point where it's talking about how pneumatics have really been a huge contributor of the total emissions. From that, what you've seen is a huge investment in instrument air. That has so many folks are now changing to air, which has benefit to that, but it's all because of the counts, the numerical aspect of the calculation that there, if you can eliminate all those components being methane emitting, that has a huge effect on your subpart W. You could argue whether it really has a huge benefit in the overall mix of methane, but from a calculation and how you're being judged, it definitely has. The problem there, though, becomes that, again, a lot of the legacy production out there has maybe not electricity, not enough economics to justify that. So looking at solar power, looking at different types of mechanical means to get rid of those pneumatics becomes an option. So some of the best practices that we're looking at is, again, we really believe that at the end of the day, attacking the source of the emissions and really looking at where the leaks are and fixing those and that can be achieved cheaply through spraying soap water on it to a more extensive way of using an OGI camera. But eliminating the emission is what everyone's after. And if you do that, then that takes care of all of that other reporting. The other thing that I'd like to talk about is good facilities design. It's amazing what we see out there where the facility design itself prevents the effectiveness of the combustor, the flare, and it really makes it hard to achieve what you're wanting to achieve just because your facilities. In fact, the problem with a lot of the legacy is the cost to change those facilities is very high. So you have to look at other options. But if you're drilling to really understand why you're using a 2-inch pipe versus a 6-inch pipe, the distance to the combustor that you have, there's a lot of things that it's pure engineering, pure numbers on what effect it has on pressure drop and the effectiveness of your control devices. Again, that point about understanding your data, how to report it, how to track it, very daunting it can be, but there are kind of the 80-20 rule where there's certain things that people are really looking at. And if you can at least cover those, you're better off and have a chance of getting through some of the challenges. Then understanding your audience. In a way, that's also like, for example, if you have a location right next to a highway, right next to a school, your audience is going to be different than if you're out in the middle of nowhere. And you have to address things differently. That's why you might have a combustor instead of a flare. It's amazing in the industry, if you have put a sound wall or you cover something, they don't see it burning, if they don't hear it, then they don't think of it. But if they hear it or they see it, it just bugs the heck out of them. So understanding your audience and how that works is such a key. Leak patches, as we said, it's 40% plus of leaks, some say even harder or higher. Human error is a huge part, just folks leaving it open. But there's also operational issues, gaskets, weight, springs, having them properly sized. That's not that expensive, and it can eliminate some of the easier to identify leaks, easier for the environmental advocacy groups that are driving around looking at these things. But even that has a lot of debate. Like, for example, gaskets. Put a gasket in just because of the fossil fuel, if you have H2S, things like that, that gasket part can not be effective. So there are some folks I know out there that change the gasket out every 6 months to be proactive. Now, the flip of that, to change your gasket, you have to open the hatch and you let all that emissions out. So damned if do, damned if no. Kind of pick which one. You have to decide kind of what's best for you and how to best handle that. Flares, those are the easy targets because they're tall. You can't miss these pictures. And so what we see is that a lot of the emissions, there's really not as much emissions on this as there are others. Partly that's the calculation for like EPA, and partly because most folks can figure out what they need to do on their flares to fix those. We are starting to see folks worrying about slip. So that's when you have air blower to the difference between these two pictures. The one without the smoke has air on it and turned up, and that allows it to burn cleaner. Now, what they're worried about is as air goes and blows through there, they're saying that some of the methane is not burned completely. However, what we're seeing through, we're actually in a situation with a customer right now. They can't document it, but they have some of these continuous monitoring that are saying that it is an issue, but they can't really tell for sure what it is. Is it just exhaust, or is it really methane? And this also fits into the point I talked about the super emitters, where it's all the Karens out there with cameras can start identifying those and saying you've got an issue, and then that's what could potentially create an issue that you're going to have to respond to and go out and deal with and document. But so sizing these and having the right type flare is really important, and that's especially the case with combustors, because with flares it's burning into an open flame, and so it can handle a lot. In a combustor, it's more limited. And as you can see by that middle picture, that's very undersized, and it's going to create not only a public relations issue and people noticing that and worrying about it, it's eventually going to burn it down because of the heat that's going. That's an example of just too much gas in the unit, or not the unit was not large enough. Then on the right side, you see an example where the gas is too heavy and it's burning down on the bottom, which has also a safety issue that it can potentially, because of this type of design, come down underneath. Now that's a little extreme, but it is very possible. So determining how to size these, and that's hard because you can't really tell how much emissions is coming off of a tank. We do a method or a direct measurement where we do a 24-hour test to see what the vapor is. But that's, you've got to understand, with have multiple wells coming in there, if they're on timing systems that open it and close at different time, it becomes a complex puzzle if you're not careful. The other thing that we really push is the need to just do good maintenance. And for example, on flares and combustors, just really making sure that your pilots are working, that your igniters are working, because if they're not, then you're usually just venting or you're venting ineffectively. So, and the other big deal is having a plan for your scrubbers. You know, this is not meant to burn liquids. You're supposed to have a scrubber before it so that the liquids are taken out, because the last thing you need is a flare spitting out liquids that are on fire. That's going to be a bigger issue than you ever want. But so but a lot of scrubbers are manual dump. You got to make sure that your pumper is always dumping that, because if it gets too full and that carries over, you're going to have a bigger issue than you really want to deal with. The other thing that folks do not, from a best practice standpoint, if you're ever going to work on a flare, you've got to be able to isolate it. You got to be able to turn a valve so that you can get in there. Because the last thing you need is someone to work underneath that flare and then it goes off. Very unsafe. And we have a lot of issues getting preventative maintenance done because we can't isolate that. So when you're doing a facility addition or changing, make sure that you have isolation valves so that you can do the proper cleaning on this. Another white paper we did is talking about pressure drop. And you know, as we all know, pressure is your friend. It allows you to get things done a lot easier. We did a study, and again, this white paper is on our website if you want to look at it, but it talks about, looks at 4-ounce, 10-ounce, and 16-ounce tanks. Then it looks at various gas rates, and it looks at the size of the pipe. Those are your three big three. Though there are other factors, but those three we determined as much larger. And what you see in a lot of the legacy wells and facilities is that a lot of it is 2-inch line. And what you see on this graph is that the 2-inch line, you're starting with 4-ounce tank. And that's assuming you don't have any safety factors. So we're just using 4 ounce. Then if you go 200 feet out, the only pressure you have is at 0.65 ounces, which is very minimal. Combustion can work, but it's not going to be as effective if you have higher pressure and able to enter that control device at a higher pressure. So looking at what you start with tanks, obviously if you have a 16-ounce tank and that additional pressure, the distance and the rate becomes so minor because you're starting at a higher pressure. But at the lower pressure, then having 2-inch lines, and a lot of these are old lines, so it's 2-inch OD, but that ID has shrunk because of buildup and all. So you're probably trying to push gas through a 1-inch space, which makes it even less of a pressure. So that's where when we talk about facility design, how important it is, because it gives you a chance of really making things work well. One of the other factors, probably the fourth factor on that whole pressure drop, is flame arresters. And it's, again, kind of a unspoken issue out there. You have, I think you all know that you have flame arresters there so that it allows the gas to go from your tank or your separator into the flare of the combustion. And then if you have a fire, it allows it to stop it and not allow it to go back to the tanks and become a more catastrophic situation. The problem with this is that you've got a lot of volume. You know, there are so many flame arresters that no one's ever cleaned. Why don't they clean it? A, they don't think about it. And P2, because it's very expensive. Because to clean those, you're typically having to shut down your facility so that you can get in there safely, open it up, clean it out, and replace it. So and you've got to have a roustabout crew usually do that. So there's cost implied and realized through that whole thing. But as you can see, with all this as an example, of course I picked the worst example, but no one really knows what theirs looks like because they haven't opened it. But if you have gas trying to come from tanks or separator to the facility, you can see the effect that that could have on your pressure and drop that pressure, again, making your control device less effective. And so the other part of this is when you have that and that gas is coming from, say, your tanks, and it's having trouble getting through, well, it backs up into your tanks. Well, if your tanks are rated at 4 ounces or 10 ounces, and you end up having it released at a certain pressure to make sure you don't overpressurize your tanks, well, that opens up your feed patch and makes you vent or methane or very expensive gas because of higher BTU. So it's a small thing, and you know, as we all know, it's a very complicated thing to produce and run a facility. But something like this can have an effect on a variety of your other equipment, either in emitting or just from a safety standpoint. I think I hit my 45 minutes almost right on time, which is always amazing. But this is just an example of some of what we provide. I will tell you, Jim was nice enough to talk about it. We have a website where it's actually a webinar that we post on a YouTube, and it's called Oilfield Strong. And what you'll see, we've had the head of enforcement for New Mexico, head of your various regulatory entities on there talking about the regulation in New Mexico. We've also had facilities folks talking about best practices, have had Michael Schellenberger, who spoke at one of the conferences up there a while back. Just a variety of folks. We've had the last one was a guy from Britain known for being kind of a leader in the green and hydrogen world, talking about how Europe thinks about what America is doing. So I urge you to look at that from an educational standpoint. And then if you want copies of these slides, you see my email address up there. Don't hesitate to email me, and I'd be happy to get those to you. Again, go onto our website and you can see the white papers and some of the information. You can download those as well.